Hello fellow sim racers! While it is true and I fully agree with the fact that the key to faster lap times is practice, 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 however I'm also a stern believer that a car setup in which you can be confident around every corner and be consistent around the racetrack is also one key element of greatness. While it can initially seem overwhelming to even consider the idea of trying to set up the car on your own, I can promise you it's worth learning at least about the basics of car setup that will help you achieve just that. And this is the aim of this short video series. In this short video series, we'll delve into some fundamental car setup tips to help you uncover that extra bit of speed in your laps and tailor your car's behavior to match your driving style. But before we proceed, it's crucial to clarify that I don't profess to be an expert in car setup, nor will these videos turn you into one. Consider these more guidelines rather than strict rules, reflecting the approaches I use when tweaking setups for race cars that are rear-wheel driven, roughly in the order that we will go through today. I will try to explain everything in a general manner so that you can apply these principles to various sim racing platforms instead of focusing on one single sim, for the most part. Before we do this, I feel I must also say to be prepared for a long session to get your setup dialed in just right. Building a setup is a dance of compromise where each change will make the car feel better in one area and maybe worse in another. And one last thing before we kick off, a golden rule: change as little at once as possible and test your change with at least 3 to 4 laps to rewrite your muscle memory and to get the proper feel for the car again after making a change. Anyway, without further ado, let's go right in. Right, here we go! But before we get out the virtual wrenches, screwdrivers and mallets, we are going to take the car out for 3 to 5 laps around the track. This is important for a couple of reasons. First, it will give us the initial information about the tire temperatures and pressures, and more importantly, it will give us the initial information about how the car behaves around the track and the information about the car itself. We can already make mental notes, or if you prefer actual notes, about how the car feels overall. During this phase, I am particularly mindful of the following things. Am I easily locking my brakes or often engaging ABS if the car is equipped with one? Am I reaching the final gear on the longest straight or maybe hitting the RPM limiter? Do I need to shift gears right before I start braking somewhere? Is my car obviously scraping along the track somewhere? Or is the track very bumpy, or does the line take me over some highly bumpy curbs at some place? Now that we have completed a couple of laps and we've gathered the first impressions about the track and the car, it's time to start adjusting the setup. Since we've gathered some initial information, we can start making changes, which I normally do them in the following order. Downforce. If the track at hand is a more open type composed of straight and full throttle sections for a good portion, like Monza or Spa for example, I will set my aero fairly low or even to minimum depending on the car and which sim I am in. For a more closed and twisted track, like for example the Hungaroring, again depending on the car and sim, I will go with a bit higher aero settings or in some cases even the maximum wing. When faced with a somewhat in-between track, like for example Suzuka, where you have long straights but also a lot of mid-speed corners like in the first sector and a very fast 130R, I will go for a somewhat balanced aero setup, not the maximum and also not the minimum. Since the wing levels have a great impact on the aero balance of the car, I usually also change the rake of the car at the same time. If I have made the rear aero more aggressive, I will raise the rear right height slightly in order to move the aero balance slightly to the front and hopefully retain at least some of the rotation, or lower the rear right height if I have lowered the rear aero. In our case at Le Mans, which consists of pretty long straights almost throughout the whole track, the compromise is pretty clear. And so I went and reduced the rear wing to the minimum to help with the speed along those long straights. Since the minimum rear wing can now make the car more nervous at the back, since I've taken away a lot of its aero from that part, I also dropped the rear ride height to move the aero balance back a bit to not have the car suddenly be uncontrollable through the corners. And increased the rear packers on the third spring to hopefully stop it from scraping along the track. Gear ratios. Some cars have the gear ratios adjustable, some don't. But in the cars where I can adjust them, I will ask myself the following. Have we hit the highest gear on the longest straight? If the answer is no, I will make the final drive or gear ratios longer in order to use the full gearing range all the time and benefit from the slightly more powerful acceleration. If I'm hitting the RPM limiter on the longest straight, or am just about to hit it, I will make the final drive or gear ratios shorter. While I will sacrifice the negligible amount of acceleration, I will prevent the car from going slower at the end of the straight due to hitting the RPM limiter, even when I am in a draft behind another car. If I'm having to shift a gear right before I need to start braking, I will make the gear from which I had to shift slightly shorter to avoid this. This might, however, require a bit of rework on all following gears, as making a single gear ratio shorter will mean that the RPM will no longer dip as far when shifting up to the next gear, and while some cars might not have the option to adjust each gear separately, you can try shortening the final drive. Now, with the current car, with the Porsche 963 and in Le Mans Ultimate, we have only one setting, long or short gear ratios. And since long give us more speed, we already have that set. Ride height and rake. Next up is ride height. You want to run the car as close to the ground as possible, at least at the front, without having the floor hit the ground, because that will unsettle the car, stop any floor generated downforce, and can impact your top speed. With the car being as close to the ground as possible, we lower its center of gravity and with it improve cornering performance. This will take some trial and error, however, to figure out how low can you actually go. But usually the default setups are set up rather safely, so you can definitely go down by at least a couple of clicks on the front. When it comes to the rear ride height, it depends on the type of the track. If you're on a more twisty track, you will want a higher difference between the front and the rear ride height, which is also called a rake. On a more open track, you will probably at this point want to maintain the same rake as your default setup, so bring the rear down by the same amount of clicks as the front. If you're just slightly hitting the ground over some bumps, you might consider hardening your suspension packers or the bump stops, which will prevent the suspension from compressing as far and save you from hitting the ground. Heave fast dampers can also be adjusted, but granted, they have a minimal effect in preventing you from hitting the floor, but will slow the compression slightly, which in theory might prevent it. Or on some cars, like on the one we are adjusting now, you also have an option of using the third spring. The third spring is activated only in situations where both left and the rear wheels are getting compressed at the same time, such as with added weight from the downforce or when hitting a bump in the road. Do note that detecting the car hitting the floor can be a bit hard if it's not disrupting the car too much, but you can look for clues like sparks flying from underneath the car, or the sound of the car hitting the ground, or the car suddenly jerking or changing direction when cornering. Since we have reduced the aero pressure by reducing the rear wing and haven't been bottoming out as much, I have tried to reduce the overall ride height slightly in the front and the rear a bit more to help with the reduced rear wing. Since the car was already scraping from time to time somewhere, I have also increased the third spring packers to help with that, since the third spring is already at the stiffest setting. Brakes. If your car has adjustable overall brake pressure, you will want to dial that down in certain situations, namely if you're easily locking up your wheels or engaging the car's ABS if it comes equipped with it. Do note, however, that you don't want to set the pressure too low, as this will extend your braking zones. A good way to adjust your braking pressure is to look for the hardest braking zone on the track. This will probably be just after the longest straight, followed by a sharp corner where you need to brake a lot. Adjust your pressure there such that you can apply maximum pressure without locking up or engaging the ABS in the beginning of the braking zone. In other areas, you will need to adjust your braking, or you can try moving the brake balance to the rear of the car if you find yourself locking with the front tires easily. Although be careful, if you set it too far to the rear, this will induce oversteer on corner entry, or it can start causing you to lock up your rear tires, particularly at the moment when you downshift, which will become very apparent in the form of a snap oversteer. While I could brake as hard as I wanted to at top speeds without locking, I have slightly increased the overall brake pressures to improve the braking performance of the car. But I did notice during my initial runs that I am locking the fronts easily and often, and therefore have moved the brake balance to the rear. Camber and tire pressure. And the final initial settings we're going to touch are camber and tire pressure, which we will cover in a single block since they both require us to look at our tire temperatures to adjust and might take several outings onto the track to get just right. In most of the simulators, the tire temperatures are measured in three areas of the tire: the outside edge, the middle, and the inside edge of the tire. Usually simulators also show this information in the setups pages like you can see here, so first we're going to take a look at the middle part of the tire. If you see that this is hotter by 5 to 10 degrees Celsius or hotter at all, you will need to decrease the overall pressure of the tire. And if the middle of the tire is colder than both the edges, you will need to increase the overall tire pressure of the tire. An important note here is for the Assetto Corsa Competizione simulator, where the optimal tire pressure is in the range of 26 to 27 psi when the tire is warm, and you should be aiming for that target, while for example in R-Factor 2 or Le Mans Ultimate in this case, in most of the cars the optimal pressure is always the lowest you can set. There can of course be exceptions, especially if the car you're driving is a third-party mod. Along with watching for the middle part of the tire being too hot or too cold, we must also check if the inside edge of the tire is hotter than the middle and therefore also the outside. If the inside edge of the tire is hotter than the outside edge by about 10 degrees, this means that the tire is leaning to the inside too much and we're not using the whole tire on the road properly and therefore sacrificing grip. In this case, we need to adjust the negative camber of the tire so that the tire will no longer lean so much to the inside, but will be more flat to the ground, which we will do by reducing the negative camber by lowering the negative number or bringing it closer to 0. In example, from negative 2.0 to negative 1.5. If the inside edge is colder than the outside edge, or there is very little difference between them temperature-wise, we need to increase the negative camber, and we do this by increasing the negative number or setting it further from 0. In example, change it from negative 1.0 to negative 1.5. Once we are happy with the tire pressures, temperatures, overall downforce, braking performance and floor clearance, this gives us a relatively good base for our setup. A general thing to keep in mind is that, again, those are only guidelines and not the de facto rules of making setups and cannot be applied to every given situation. However, they are still a good starting point when making setups. Before closing off, on the screen right now are a couple of more general setup and driving tips to apply in certain situations that we will not go into any more particular detail at the moment. With this, we have covered the basics of starting off with a setup for a race car, but in the next video we will explore setup tips you can try when attempting to solve handling issues, such as understeering and oversteering during cornering. The setup guidelines image that I have been using during the making of the first part of this short video series will also be available for everyone to download in the part 2 video, so that you can go through it at your own speed or even keep it open on a separate screen or print it out and nail it to a wall for when you need to make a quick setup change. If you have made it this far and hopefully have learned a couple of new things about setting up a car, I thank you very much for your time and attention, and ask only if you can leave a like and share this video. If you have further questions or even just comments, please feel free to input them in the comment sections below or reach out to me on Discord or any other means, links for which are available in the video description. I am looking forward to hearing from you. And thank you one more time for watching, and remember to subscribe to the channel to catch the next part of the setup guide. Until then, Have an awesome time, and remember to go tear up that tarmac.